Hello, and welcome to Define American with Jose Antonio Vargas. I'm Jose. It's been nearly 2 months since Trump took office, and he's been flooding the zone as promised, putting out more executive orders and government shakeups than anyone can keep track of. Of course, cracking down on the rights of immigrants was one of his campaign promises. He started making good on that promise on day one with his blatantly unconstitutional executive order on birthright citizenship. Meanwhile, Democrats in Congress still seem to be trying to figure out what they can do to fight back. My guest today to talk about this and so much more is Congresswoman Pramila Jayapal. Congresswoman Jayapal is the representative for Washington's 7th Congressional District, which encompasses the Seattle metro area, where almost 20% of residents are foreign-born, including a large Asian immigrant population. Born in Chennai, India, she became the first South Asian American woman elected to the U.S. House of Representatives in January 2016 and is one of about 24 immigrants in Congress. She's also the only member of Congress who was an H-1B visa recipient. Before entering Congress, she had a long history of grassroots organizing, advocating for strengthening immigrant rights and changing the narrative around immigrants' contribution to the United States. Congresswoman, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
We are talking really literally the morning after President Trump's first address to Congress here, which you attended, wearing a bright pink jacket together with other Democratic women in protest. What did you hear from the president that stood out to you?
Well, a couple things stood out to me. One, that he said absolutely nothing that addresses the cost of things for the American public. Nothing about the economy, how he's going to reduce prices, which he said he was going to do on day one. But he doesn't have any plans for that. And that was really the reason people elected him, is because they thought that he was somehow going to make their grocery prices go down or their housing prices go down. The second thing that stood out to me was just how painful it was for us to listen to. It was so divisive, so xenophobic, so racist, so completely disparaging of the idea that we have two parties, that we have a constitution that has a role for Congress, that has a role for the judiciary. And the third thing that stood out was that, look, he wants to lift up unelected billionaires like Elon Musk, and he wants to rig the system even more than it is rigged now to steal from the American people and give it to unelected billionaires like Elon Musk. One of the loudest moments of opposition came when he said, we need to get rid of the unelected bureaucrats. Well, he brought in one who is a billionaire who is destroying our entire system of government. So, I think those were probably the main things, but it was painful to be in there, frankly, and to see what has happened to our country and what he has promoted.
Did you get a sense that maybe I should walk out? I'm just
curious. Oh yeah, it was a conversation in my mind the whole time about whether I should go or not, or whether I should boycott, because I do think, and there are good reasons. The reason I decided to do what I did was because I didn't want, what they do is they fill the seats with Republicans if you don't go. I did not want
they're seat fillers.
Yes, they're seat fillers.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yes. So I didn't want the gallery to be filled with people who just stood up at everything that he said, which is what Republicans did. And so we wanted to preserve space for Democrats to show that we disagree with what he's saying. And we wanted to do it in a respectful way. But I should just remind people that the Republicans are the ones who yelled at Barack Obama, you lie. The Republicans are the ones who Marjorie Taylor Greene heckled President Biden when he came multiple times. And so they don't have any sense of decorum, and it's very difficult to hold a standard of decorum in a place where they're disrespecting the fundamental role, Article 1 role of Congress.
I was watching it, online, like a lot of people were, and I just thought to myself, more than any other moment, because it was so long, I felt like I was watching an edited version of The Apprentice, and at some point, like a TV show. And you, having the background that you have, and I'll go more into that later, how did it feel like as a woman, as an immigrant woman? Like, how did that feel like being in that room?
Terrible. You know, I mean, he rails on immigrants, calls us murderers, calls us criminals. That is everything that the mass deportation plan is trying to do, is criminalize a huge group of people simply for being immigrant. And no, they're not really making distinctions between undocumented and documented anymore
There's
either.
yeah.
There's no, I mean, right, they want to strip birthright citizenship. And so it felt terrible on that level, just on a personal level. And for all of the people that I know through my history of working with immigration and immigrant rights, all of the people who are deeply contributing to our economy every day and who are being swept under the rug and told that they are doing nothing, no acknowledgement, no respect, no dignity for the work they do, without which our country would simply not be able to manage. And then third, just on a collective level, what does it mean for the United States to suddenly stop accepting people from other countries, whether it's refugees, whether it's employment visas, whether it's recognizing those who are here, students who are coming. There are huge economic impacts and moral consequences to a decision to close off immigration and just provide a gold card, which, by the way, he can't do without Congress, what he said about we're just gonna, if you pay $5 million bucks, then suddenly you get to come here.
Citizenship is for sale.
Citizenship is for sale. Maybe are we gonna start putting like bricks in the Washington Monument with people's names? I mean, what is this coming to? This is not policy that governs a country's best interests.
Ever since Donald Trump walked down that escalator, has been almost a decade-long attack on immigrants.
Yeah.
And for me, watching you these past few years rise within the Democratic Party, how does it feel like this mainstreaming of anti-immigrant sentiment right there in the people's house, right? As the president, how does that feel like for you?
Like I said, it feels terrible on the personal level, on the collective level, on the global level for our country. And I'm now the top Democrat on the Immigration Subcommittee. So if we ever were to retake the House, I would be the chair of the Immigration Subcommittee. And I think back, Jose, to our, all of our work together over the last several decades. And we have taken enormous steps backwards, including within the Democratic Party, I think. We have taken enormous steps backward from even the ability to really push the idea that border security cannot happen without a legal functioning system that allows people to be here, to be with their families. If you don't have legal pathways, you cannot have border security, because at the end of the day, the two have to go together. People will come to the border if that's the only way to get in. But if you give people choices, if you allow people to come in multiple different ways, and if you respect those who have been here, long-term undocumented who have been here for 10, 15 years, there needs to be some level of fairness and belief in reforming a system that is antiquated. Nobody thinks it works. It's been, we are operating from caps that limit the number of people who can come in different categories, if we even have them, to numbers that were set 30 years ago. And so I think that, it's very distressing, because I think at the end of the day, I don't think Republicans want to fix the immigration system. There was a day back in 2013 when 67 senators of both parties voted for a comprehensive immigration reform. And that would have put money into securing the border, and it would have modernized the immigration system. It would have legalized dreamers so that people aren't in a limbo status. It would have provided employment opportunities. It would have brought families together. Why should a U.S. citizen not be able to bring their spouse into this country or have legal status for their for a U.S. citizen spouse or kids? So it brought some fairness into the system, but it was a recognition that we had to do it all.
Just to put it into context, I mean, you've been very consistent about this in local media. You just gave an interview to King 5 in Seattle saying that you cannot modernize border security without modernizing the whole system.
Exactly.
And now I have to ask you this, and you just alluded to this. We met in 2011.
Yes.
when you were the head of One America,
Yeah.
which became, it was Hate Free Zone,
Yeah.
was the organization that was born after 9/11. And
Correct.
anybody listening and watching knows that immigration in this country
Yep.
changed significantly
Yep.
after 9/11, and what Muslims and people of Sikh background had to go
Exactly.
through, right? So you started that. Can you contextualize for us, are we at the bottom when it comes to where we are in immigrant rights in this country? Is this the bottom? Does it feel like
I mean,
for
it's
you?
certainly the bottom in terms of recent history. I think we've had a lot of bottoms in immigration history. I think the Japanese internment, the Chinese Exclusion
Absolutely.
Act. There have been many horrible periods of immigration in this country. It hasn't all been great, but certainly in recent history, in the 2 decades that I've been working on this issue, going back to 2001, when I started this, scrappy little nonprofit organization that grew to be the largest immigrant rights organization in Washington State, one of the largest in the country, to now, we are, I think, at the bottom of what I saw. After 9/11, it was really directed at particular communities, but I think
Targeted.
that
It was
targeted
targeted,
communities. I do remember, though, that at the same time, the American labor movement actually took a big step forward and actually embraced immigration after a pretty isolationist thing. So even though there was that backward sliding on targeted communities, there was also a forward recognition lead up to the 2003 Immigrant Workers' Freedom Ride, when there was a recognition that we need to address the modernization of the system. Today, I think I have not seen us in such a bad place where increasing numbers of Americans favor mass deportation plans. I will say, though, a lot depends on what options you give them. If you give somebody an option of deporting everybody or having a humane system that provides a legal process for people, and yes, people who don't meet that process get deported, whether it's because of criminal convictions or other things, they will always choose a more humane system, despite all of the attacks on immigrants. So I think that says something about the collective desire of people on all sides of the aisle to embrace immigrants in this country. And yet, there is a guy in the White House who has and his party, who have consistently stoked nativist, white supremacist, xenophobic views that are making it through to some people because people are frustrated with the fact that the system is not working and they don't understand why we're not fixing it.
They don't understand why we're not fixing it. And also, I have to say, Twitter, which is now X, which is owned by Elon Musk. I mean, you just see kind of this media. There's a media ecosystem that has fed and kind of gotten us to this point.
Yes.
One thing you were alluding to is back in 2013, there were Republicans, congressional members, senators.
Yeah.
Now, I mean, you just introduced the Dream and Promise Act.
There's one Republican.
With one Republican.
Yeah.
What are the chances that you'll get more?
Most of the people that were on that before, the Republicans that were on it before, are out. They've been taken out by conservatives in those districts. This has become a cult party of Republicans. And I think one of the big things we have to see is as Trump ramps up his mass deportation and Stephen Miller and all these people ramp up this mass deportation agenda, what is the cost to local communities, to families, to the economy?
To congressional districts all across the country.
Everywhere. And so one of the things that I intend to do as ranking member on the Immigration Subcommittee, we can't hold hearings because we don't have the power to determine hearings that are in Congress, but we can hold field hearings. And so we intend to go to Republican districts and states and hear from people about what does it mean to agriculture in America if undocumented immigrants aren't showing up for work, if mixed status families are being torn apart, if ICE is showing up at local schools and all kids, not just immigrant kids, but all kids are terrorized by these agents that show up at schools. How do we get Americans to start to think about the costs of what is happening right now and the need, once again, to focus us on modernizing the antiquated system?
Do you think these questions, again, of what these specific detailed costs are, Are these stories getting out there? Do you see that that's getting out there?
Not in any substantial way. And part of it is, we have been prioritizing doing podcasts, doing shows that aren't just cable news, because I do think that we have to be out there with these stories in different forms. And we need to, because X is now controlled by Elon Musk, who has no interest in fairness or, truth. Facts. And so I think the hit to journalism overall, and you're such a brilliant journalist, that is a big problem. People don't know who to believe. So we're not operating from the same set of facts. And so people can very easily be swayed. I do think personal stories from our days, your incredible storytelling on behalf of dreamers, that is ultimately still one of the most powerful tools we have.
And I just want to name, the one Republican sponsor is Maria Elvira Salazar of Florida. I'm just curious, Congresswoman, what's your pitch when you pitch Republicans of why they should sign up, right, for this bill? What do you tell them?
Well, every Republican does have dreamers in their district. They do. And so and the Dream movement, thanks to dreamers who really powered and fueled that movement, that is something that the vast majority of Americans, regardless of party, agree.
Poll after poll.
Poll after poll. That has not, maybe it's diminished a little bit, but it's still extraordinary numbers. And so I don't find that Republicans actually disagree with the fundamental premise of fairness. These are folks who didn't have control over when they came, how they came. Some of them didn't even know that they were here undocumented.
They're American without papers.
They're American without papers. They are us. Dreamers are us. I mean, a lot of the things we've been saying, I think those messages have broken through. But the question is, are there Republicans willing to defy Donald Trump? Now, I should say that Donald Trump, time and time again, has said that he believes that dreamers are extraordinary young people, that they should be allowed to stay. And yet, he is the one who challenged the DACA administration in his the DACA program in his first term. That's the whole reason the Supreme Court is now in charge of what happens to dreamers across the country. And so I think people should not be fooled by the idea that Donald Trump somehow is some savior. He is the one that destroyed the DACA program.
And I will say that not a day goes by that I don't hear from a DACA recipient every day who's just preparing for the worst are making decisions to leave. Right. Just last night, I heard from somebody who is a nurse, and we need more nurses, who decided to just leave. That they can't live with this roller coaster anymore. That's right.
And we're going to see the economic impacts of that. There's a moral impact of it, of course. I don't want to undermine that. But we are going to see the economic impacts. And I think Americans across this country will be asked, is this what you want? And what is the cost of these horrific programs that Trump is putting in place?
Going back to President Trump, campaigning on this promise of mass deportations. But so far, it seems like it's been more spectacle than anything, right? Arrests are up, but the pace of deportation has been about the same as it was under the Biden administration. What do you make of that?
Well, I think that and he just fired the person who he had installed because he didn't think it was moving fast enough. So I think the threat is real. The bills that are being passed essentially all follow the same formula. Whether it's Laken Riley, which he brought up last night, or whether it's a bill that we worked on around domestic violence. They essentially, what those bills do is they take something that is already a horrible crime that is already deportable or inadmissible, right? So if you're a convicted murderer, you're not going to be allowed to stay here, and you shouldn't be. And if you had your fair day in court, you've been convicted. There's
due process.
Due process.
Due process.
But they take that, make you think that that's not already the law, and then worse, they expand it so that it includes just an accusation, no conviction, no fair day in court. So that means that if you or I walk into a shop and a shopkeeper doesn't like the way we look, he can accuse us of shoplifting. This is Laken Riley.
This is Laken Riley.
And he can then, once I'm arrested or you're arrested simply for the accusation, you are now deportable. And so that could be a DACA student, it could be a legal permanent resident, it could be anyone that speaks Spanish, it could be any number of things. But there's no fair day in court. The simple act of arrest or accusation makes you a criminal. And you know all the problems with that. And so this is what he's trying to do, is criminalize everybody simply for being an immigrant. And I'm not distinguishing between undocumented or documented, because it actually, many of these things apply to legal permanent residents.
I must ask this question. Is the worst yet to come? And what does the worst look like?
The worst is yet to come. And the worst, I think, looks like, again, a destruction of all the legal pathways, destruction to our economy, whether it's agriculture, whether it's nursing, whether it's healthcare, whether it's small businesses that are fueled by so many immigrants across this country. Communities are going to feel the economic impact, and families are going to be devastated, because we will have mixed status families, that's some who are US citizens or legal residents, plus undocumented, who will be torn apart. And our kids are going to be traumatized, but the entire American community will be traumatized, because again, immigrants are part of our communities, and others will feel the effects of this as well.
So what's the strategy for these next 4 years? Like, what tools does Congress have to stand up to things like Trump's plans for mass deportation, and what the worst is?
Well, there's, because we don't have majorities in the House or the Senate or the White House, it becomes difficult for us to, in the House, it becomes difficult for us to stop legislation from moving forward unless we hold every Democrat, not easy.
Especially now.
And we get a couple of Republicans. So that has to be the strategy, is how do we hold all Democrats and get a couple of Republicans. And the Senate, if it's a policy bill around immigration, they actually do need 10 votes. So I think people need to be very focused on ensuring that we hold Senate Democrats, because without Senate Democrats, they cannot pass these bills. Laken Riley passed with Senate Democratic votes and House Democratic votes.
And I have to ask, Congresswoman, I can only imagine the conversations that you were having with those Senate Democrats. Is there anything you can share with us about what those conversations were like?
Nothing specific, but I think that the strength of the House vote, with a lot of House Democrats voting for it, was not helpful. And then I think that a lot of people were not necessarily prepared to have it come over there. And look, we've got to get a spine on this. We just have to get a spine, because trying to be Republican light has never worked for Democrats. I mean, most people choose Coke, not Coke Light, for a reason, because they want the real thing. And we have to decide, do we have values that we stand up for as Democrats around immigration, and ensuring that we modernize the system and that we have a humane system, or not? And if we want to just try and be Republican light, we should just remember that not only will we lose our base, but we will never win Republicans who would rather have the real thing of, the Republican deportation machine.
I would say, though, that I think what's really tricky with this specific issue is you have the people who are directly impacted can't vote.
Yeah.
Right? Like, undocumented people cannot vote in elections to elect congressional districts. And so we are at the mercy of allies.
Yeah.
And I want to bring up allies. Here right now at this moment, who are those allies that you count on?
Well, I'll tell you, if you're talking about outside allies.
Outside allies.
Yeah. So, because I'm an organizer, so I always think about inside, outside. To me, the labor movement is a really important partner in this. And I do remember when labor nationally was anti-immigrant. And we completely shifted that, because so many of these unions, their workers are affected. And I'll just give you a small example. I had a labor roundtable in the district a couple of weeks ago, and we were talking about everything. I mean, we have federal workers who have been fired. There are lots of issues for labor. But I will tell you, the number one thing that came up over and over again was immigration. Not because I brought it up. I didn't even mention it in my opening comments. I just talked about wanting to hear what was on their minds. This came up. And I'm going to talk to, there's a national group of labor presidents who are focused on immigration. I'm going to talk to them as well. And the reason is because I think that connects community and economy. It connects effects on families and along with effects on workers, right? Those are the same thing, and the effect on the economy in these different industries, I think, is a very important message to Americans. I think the other community of people that are really important, or institutions, is faith. I mean, this is another place where we have, as a movement, been successful in bringing in everyone from, different religious denominations, including the Pope himself.
Yeah.
So I think, making sure that we're bringing people of faith that are
all
spread
races and
across
backgrounds.
all races and backgrounds, spread across the country, that is also a very important community. And then the third, of course, is the community of business. I mean, this has been harder because we have a lot of businesses who tell us that their business would collapse without immigrant labor, but then they're not willing to go and put that as their number one consideration ahead of tax breaks for the biggest corporations. We got to get them back in. There are some. We did a press conference last year with businesses, and we had Microsoft, a senior vice president from Microsoft came, and they've stood by.
They've been very consistent.
They've been very consistent, and I think that is the kind of leadership we want to see from business leaders as well. And then, of course, our community of nonprofits and advocacy groups and immigrant groups who are at the center of feeling the impact, right? A lot of what we've tried to emphasize all along is who is directly impacted and how do we have those voices at the table.
Speaking of directly impacted, I'm sitting here at your office, thank you for having us, and I'm looking literally at a poster that's in the middle of your office from Seattle Magazine. This is Sanctuary City, it says. Earlier today, mayors of 4 sanctuary cities were summoned here to Washington to testify before the House Oversight Committee about the, quote, policies of sanctuary jurisdictions and their impact on public safety and federal immigration enforcement. Washington is one of 11 sanctuary states, and Governor Bob Ferguson has confirmed his commitment to that. So what can the Trump administration really do to push sanctuary states to work with them on mass deportation?
Well, what they're threatening to do is withdraw all federal funding for any jurisdiction if they don't cooperate with their mass deportation plans. And what we have said is that is not in the interest of public safety, that is not in the interest of families and communities, and it's not in the interest of our state, and so, or local jurisdiction. And so we've again been trying to lift up certain voices. So I'm very proud. We have a new police chief. He came from Wisconsin, but he and a number of other major city chiefs signed a letter to Congress saying that doing what they want to do in their sanctuary cities bill. I forget what it's called, banning something. something. It's basically taking away all federal funding from sanctuary cities. That they did not support that, and there would be huge consequences to law enforcement's ability to function effectively, right? Because there's always been this distinction between federal enforcement and local law enforcement. And when you have people who are afraid that they are going to be charged for being here based on their immigration status, they're not going to come forward and help local law enforcement to deal with the crimes that are happening around them. So it's very important that people feel the ability to talk to local law enforcement and that everyone is kept safe by local law enforcement. So we've had a long-standing commitment, and we're trying to lift up that voice. And we're also happy that the mayors have also been weighing in and really pushing back hard, because again, what they're trying to do is not just take away federal funds for a particular program. They're saying no federal funding at all.
At all.
Right? Unless you're checking immigration status. So if you're getting DOT, Department of Transportation funding for public transit, that if you're not checking the status of every person that's using your public transit, then somehow you don't get to qualify for federal funds. So it's completely unworkable and completely unconstitutional.
And again, I was remembering before this interview, I was remembering when we met in 2011, when I went to Seattle, this was like a few months after I had come out as undocumented.
Yeah.
I remember just meeting for the first time the sheer diversity of undocumented people.
Yeah.
Because they were at this conference.
Yes.
Right? Black immigrants, South Asian immigrants.
Yeah.
I remember, I think it was the first time I met an undocumented Indian, I think he was an engineer who had
Yeah.
overstayed his visa. So just really the sheer diversity
Yeah.
of this. I'm just curious, Congresswoman, what are you telling undocumented people in your district today?
Yeah, I mean, look, I have such a deep relationship with the undocumented population in Seattle because I started the organization
Yeah.
that really fought for them, and so I have a lot of friends, people that I've worked with
This
for a
is
long
personal.
time. It's personal, and I know these people,
Yeah.
and they've been in the streets with me, and I've been in the streets with them, and so they know what I'm trying to do, which is to build our movement back again, right? To build the ability to talk to expand who we're talking to make sure that stories are getting out, to make sure that we're being coordinated and smart in our messaging, because it is a different time, and we do have to recognize that we've taken steps backwards on even things that you and I would have taken for granted, say, back in 2011,
Yeah.
10 years ago. So we do have to talk about border security because people care about border security.
Yes.
But we also have to talk about modernizing the system and being fair to people and making sure that we preserve our greatness as a country that comes from immigrants from all over the world. And so we've been doing a lot of strategizing with our groups, with our members, with folks who are undocumented. We've been trying to help in every way we can with people who are afraid. We've been doing Know Your Rights presentations with other groups. I just did a big town hall, and I had the executive director of the Northwest Immigrant Rights Project, which is the only organization that provides legal services. It's a nonprofit to people. And so Malu talked about their work with unaccompanied kids. And so I think we're doing everything we can at the local level. My message is don't give up. You're too important. Your voice is too important. The issue is too important. Your family is too important. And we're not giving up. We're going to be there every step of the way. And we're going to rebuild this. And we have to. We don't have a choice, right? We don't have a choice.
I'm curious, again, this conversation I had last night, what would you say to an undocumented person who's called this country their home for this person last night 21 years and have just said, I want out of the roller coaster? What do you say to people who are deciding to leave?
I mean, it's really painful, but what can you say? If people want to make that choice, that is their right to make that choice. And it's an appropriate reaction to decades of living in the shadows. And I think I'm certainly not about to criticize that. To those who are willing to try to fight back and to stay, who have family members who are here, who have economic interests, whatever it is, I am saying, come in, let's build that tent. But certainly I understand. I mean, there are people for whom, I have so many close friends who are in this situation. I mean, personal friends of mine for decades who are in this situation. And I do think it's a very personal choice. And I think that the loss is America's loss of people who are leaving. It is America's loss that we will lose incredible, talented, committed, dedicated Americans. Define American, right? It is America's loss that we are losing these fine Americans in every sense of the word, except for what papers they carry.
For the record, you are the first congressional member that we're interviewing for this podcast, and I think that's only appropriate. And as given your own personal history, you're the only member of Congress who was an H-1B recipient. Can you actually talk to us more about that, your own personal immigrant story?
Yeah. Well, I came here at 16 years old. I was born in India, and my parents had $5,000 in their bank account. But for whatever reason, they really believed in an American education. And so my dad took that $5,000 and he sent me here at 16 by myself. And I don't think they ever anticipated that I would never again live on the same continent as them, but it took me 17 years and an 17 and an alphabet soup of visas, including an H-1B, to be able to get my citizenship. And So I understand, and I was fortunate because I had legal status the whole time. I was not undocumented, but it still was this roller coaster of how am I going to stay? How am I going to do this? And so by the time I got my citizenship, it was too late for my parents. They were older and they had to make a decision of whether they could come to America or go back to India. They couldn't come to America because I wasn't a citizen yet to sponsor them, and so they went back to India. So I've never lived on the same continent as them. And that time of being an H-1B, because I was on a student visa, and then I was on a practical training visa, and then I was on H-1B, I just think that there are a lot of people out there who do not understand how complicated the immigration system is, and that it is a civil system. It is not a criminal system. It is not a crime, by the definition of the criminal justice system, to be in this country without documented presence.
By the way, what you just said,
Yeah.
the amount of time I had to keep explaining that to my own fellow journalists who cover immigration as a political issue and not as a process procedural one.
I know. It's a process argument, and sometimes it's difficult to make it. But the reason I bring it up is because if it were a criminal system, I say to my colleagues across the aisle all the time, you want to make it seem like undocumented presence is a criminal offense, but it's not. If it were, every single undocumented person would get access to an attorney. But we don't do that because it's a civil system.
We can send them to Guantanamo Bay.
We could send them, which they're backing off on now because they're finding that it's not actually feasible to do that. So let's see what happens there. But yeah, I mean, this is an important point because it's hard to navigate the system. And that's with the pathways we have. People say, get in line. You've heard this for years. Yeah. Get in line. I'm like, what line do you think there is? There is no line for people who have been doing this work. And, there's all kinds of things we could get into about how the undocumented population soared when we started building more walls on the border and making it harder for people to come in and out. When we had circular flow migration, at least countries in the hemisphere would send people here for 6 months. People would come over for 6 months, they'd work, and then they'd go home, take the money, and start to build a house in Mexico or Guatemala or wherever. And that's not possible now. So then we started to see people staying because we had no way for people to actually come back and go out and come back and go out.
It's hard to think of another issue that has taken center stage in the American life in which the American public are really not on the same page about what the facts are. In this Congress, the journalists were covering what's going on in this Congress. And as you're saying it, the one thing that you just said that I want to double click on, so you said that you haven't lived in the same continent with your parents for?
Since I was 16, and I'm 60, gonna be 60 this year. So for 44 years, I have not been able to live on the same continent as my parents.
What does that feel like?
Heartbreaking, especially as my father just passed away literally last month.
Yeah, I heard about that.
And my mom is, she's struggling. She has Parkinson's, she's alone, and I'm here. And so it's the sacrifice that they made in sending me here. I've asked my parents if they thought about that at the time. And because I have a daughter who's 28, and I thought about it when she turned 16. I thought, would I be able to send my daughter across the ocean and not know if she would ever come back? And I don't think I could have done that. I don't think I would have had the courage or, maybe the interest in her future to be able to separate her from me. So when we think about what people give up, the emotional toll of it and the sacrifice that parents make, that kids make, the idea that kids would just come across the border because it's fun and easy and they want to game the American system is insane. It's insane.
I have to say, I am living through a different version of what you just described. My mother, people watching, listening to the podcast knows that I was waiting on my mother to come, so I have not seen her for 31 years. Ugh. She just came 12 days ago?
Oh.
And I'm still processing sharing the space with her, so I haven't seen her since I was 12. I'm 44 now. And my sister, who I haven't seen since she was 2, barely 2, is with her on a tourist visa.
Oh my
So for the
gosh.
first time, we have like a family reunion
family
thing
reunion.
going. And I have to tell you, like the emotional landscape of this,
Yeah.
I don't.
It's
bigger.
very
As Toni
difficult.
Morrison would say, it's bigger than language. I don't have the language as my producers of this podcast now, because they're waiting on me to produce this podcast about what it's been like, the reunion. And I'm like, what do I do? What do I say?
It's really hard. And I'm not sure that it will come quickly, you know, because I think it also comes in pieces. Because what does it feel like when you haven't seen your mother for 31 years? You actually have to create a whole new notion of both the physical and the emotional space that most people take for granted with a family.
And you sharing your story about your parents just now, in many ways, this country for centuries have lived on that bet that these parents make, right?
That's right.
That said, and that for me, I have to say, Congresswoman, is what I'm trying to bridge that gap.
Yeah.
Of all the anti-immigrant
Yeah.
congressional members of this president, how do we not apply what the Germans and the Italians and the Irish and the Dutch went through? Why is it that we can't bridge the gap between all those European immigrants coming from Europe to the immigrants from India and the Philippines and China and Mexico who are coming now?
Well, you know, there's always been this joke about how the Statue of Liberty only faces one way, right? But I think that, so you have to just acknowledge the role of race and ethnicity in all of this. I also think that this goes back to the question of what people know and the fact that we don't share a common set of facts. Because I had a Republican on the other side of the aisle tell me that we should do what used to happen at Ellis Island, that if we could just do what used to happen at Ellis Island, then he would be all fine. So I actually wrote a little description of what happened at Ellis Island, because actually I'd be great with doing what we did at Ellis Island. There were no documents required. People were able to work immediately. Yeah, you had to show that you could take care of yourself, you know, you had to have, but I mean, a lot of what people think of as being a fair process that allowed their parents or grandparents to come in is all we're advocating for.
Same process.
So once I showed him
what was the reaction?
What the process was, well, then I think he wasn't so inclined to do what happened at Ellis Island.
Unfortunately, our time is running out, and I have to ask you this question. And you're in a very unique role here, right? A prominent activist in the immigrant rights movement who is now on the other side. You just made a comment that you think outside, inside.
Yeah.
What is your message to activists and organizers right now? I have to say, many of them are my friends. For them, this is definitely the bottom.
Yeah.
This feels like, I don't know what's happening, Jose.
Yeah.
I can't even get on MSNBC. I can't even, like, you know, this idea that it's almost as if we are living in this anti-immigrant era and trying to figure out the spaces that we can occupy.
Yeah.
What is your message to the activists and organizers on the ground doing the work?
Yeah, my message is that we know as activists and organizers that strength comes in these moments of crisis. It doesn't mean that everyone can do the same thing. People may not be able to tell their stories in the same way, but we can find intermediaries to tell those stories for us. We can film in different ways without showing a face, without giving a name, to protect people's identity. And there will be people who are willing to take the kind of risks that undocumented immigrants took with us when we organized 100 women to get arrested for immigration reform in, I think it was 2011.
I remember
those women were undocumented. They were willing to take risks. So I don't think we should assume that people can't. I think we have to be smart, coordinated, strategic. We have to look at what message we want to send. We have to think about how we give facts simply that cut through sort of the technical processes. This is not easy for us because immigration is a complicated issue. But my message is, let's stay in this fight in whatever way you can. And let's remember that at the end of the day, it is good organizing and people doing that organizing and people who are directly affected that have the power of the story and hold the power of the human heart. And that's what we're trying to get, is the human heart of Americans across this country, who I believe, despite all of the attacks, still believe in immigration as a critical force for good, as the humane, moral thing to do to keep our country welcoming immigrants from everywhere.
And that this is a country of welcome.
Yes.
This is a country of
This
welcome.
is a country of welcome.
Well, thank you so much for having us,
Thank
Congresswoman.
you.
And I look forward to being in touch, and I actually think there are some ways that we can work together as we tell these
I would love
stories
it.
and make sure that we are keeping humanity front and center.
Thank you for everything you've been doing.
Thank you.